This conference will now be recorded.
Lights, Dave, lights, do you want them down or up?
Yes, please, if so that people can see that. Is that okay?
Trying to go compromise.
Sure. I think I'll just move the microphone closer to you, if that's all right.
It's picking up, fine.
Is it? Right. Just move it then anyway.
Is that okay?
We're going to be going slightly further that way, just so there's a little bit of light on you. That'd be good, yeah. Just try to see you there, fine. Yeah.
Okay, over to you.
Right. Well, I think we've already covered more or less the basis of the talk about the problems at Cowley and the ongoing flooding that's been disrupting all the traffic to the west of England on regular occasions. But I thought it might be interesting to actually look into the background of it, because it's always been blamed on the way the river was diverted when the Bristol-Exeter line was built. So I thought I'd do a bit of investigation. And see if we're moving on. Having a problem with the clicker. Oh, there we go.
Down.
So I've been delving into what went before the railways came back into the early 18th century, and also I've gone through what's happened since the development of the railways, the various flood events, the attempts at flood alleviation, and up to the present day. I'm sure you've read all that whilst I've been rattling on. So moving on, that's where Cowley Bridge Junction is, which I expect most of you know, about 1.5 miles north of St David's Station. It's where the two valleys meet, the River Exe and the River Creedy. Two roads, two rivers and two railways. And in more detail, that's what we have at the moment. We have the River Exe coming down here from the northwest, following the Great Western Main Line, originally at Bristol and Exeter, coming down to Cowley Bridge Junction here. There's the Tarka, what is now called the Tarka line, coming down from Crediton and Oakhampton, of course, and then the corresponding roads which are there long before the railways, one from Crediton and the other one from Stoke Cannon, coming down to all meet at the famous Cowley Bridge Junction. Present day, you have the two rivers, the River Exe, which comes down and goes through the bridge at the junction, and then the River Creedy, which comes down from Crediton down the Creedy Valley. I was interested, it's a bit fuzzy I'm afraid on this screen, where the rivers actually ran. So I looked back at some of the old OS maps and realised that in fact the administrative boundary follows what used to be the line of the river, which is a big clue really. So I thought, well, what can I find earlier than that? And the earliest pre-OS map that I could find was the, sorry, that one. Yeah. Won't work.
Something's happened.
Yeah,
Something's flashing.
Yeah, I probably pressed the wrong button.
You changed what you're doing on the screen.
Sorry, probably.
That's fine. Wait, I can do it on there and it might come back. There we go.
Oh, okay.
Right, take two.
So the earliest plan that I could find, which Mark very kindly dug out from the offices at Swindon, was the original Bristol and Exeter Parliamentary Deposit Plan, which shows where they were proposing to put the line. That is the actual proposed centre line. It was nowhere near where it's actually built. But you can see quite clearly how the River Exe actually ran it wiggled all around across the floodplain, the subsidiary channels, and went off in this direction. There were only subsidiary sort of watercourses going down beyond the Crediton Road. Incidentally, the surveyor was William Garrett, who invented the dumpy level. I don't know whether anybody remembers the dumpy level or knows what it was, but that was Brunel's surveyor for that particular part of the line. So I'll get used to this in a minute. So that basically is where the rivers were when, well, before the roads came. And of course, there is the centre line of where the two railways, the Bristol and Exeter and later Exeter and Crediton were built, which explains quite a lot. Interestingly, the three main features on the which still exist today, but which were there at that time, are the Cowley Bridge Inn, the Cowley Bridge, and the waterworks. But the waterworks wasn't on William Garrett's plan. So you can still see when there's in times of flood where those watercourses used to run very, very clearly. These different sort of channels are clear there. They simply mimic the original courses of the rivers. So that's what we had. We had the waterworks. Well, the first building was pre-1956, the dear old Cowley Bridge Inn, and which was actually on the crossroads of the Crediton Road, Cowley Bridge, and then later the waterworks, when they still exist today in their different forms. Anyway, along came the Bristol and Exeter Railway, and that was where they straightened the river, which is alleged to be the problem with all the central flooding. But there were still these bits sort of running across floodplain over to the River Creedy, which was the original confluence, actually, the Exe and the Creedy. And the Bristol and Exeter built the Cowley Weir, and so I'm still going to use this down there. And the bridge carrying the Crediton Road, which had been diverted over the Exe. The lovely arch bridge which still exists over the railway. And then on 1841, the line was opened at Exeter St David's, which is a bit different from what it was by the 1920s, which is a bit different from what it is today. It's interesting the way things have changed. Well, the next one was Exeter and Crediton Railway. Now that this is where it becomes really a Gilbert and Sullivan opera, with the shenanigans that went on. It was built as broad gauge double line in 1847. There's no connection to the Bristol and Exeter Railway because they couldn't get any lease agreed. The LSWR turned in, joined in the fray by putting in a whole load of directors, and they decided to convert it to standard gauge, hoping to connect it to their new line coming down to Exeter. Then the Gauge Commissioner said that they couldn't use it as a standard gauge line because it was been authorised as a broad gauge line. So they decided they would build a temporary station at Cowley Bridge. When we were preparing this presentation and the video that follows it, we assumed, as I said, it was going to be in Cowley Meadows, that it would be sort of somewhere here, possibly. We thought, well, Cowley Meadows, that's the that's the target line there. The junction's down here. We thought, well, they'd probably put it here with a nice little access here. Plus this cottage, that might be part of the station building. But no, it wasn't, apparently. That was a new toll house that was built after the road was diverted to go over the top of the Bristol and Exeter line. And then the Broadgate Society, just last week, came up with this information. And in fact, the temporary station was over here. The temporary station was by the railway, the carriage road coming onto the Bedford Road on a timber bridge with station facilities actually up there by the railway, which had a booking office and porter's room, the ladies' room, and the gents, which was conveniently sited over the adjacent waterway, which was, I'm not sure whether that would have been quite the thing these days. So that was the situation, but in fact, it was never used. Eventually, the Bristol and Exeter came to an agreement with the Exeter and Crediton Railway for a lease, and we finished up with the whole thing being abandoned. And before, so there's an interesting oil painting which is done at the time, which suggests that, well, there's the Exeter Bridge probably. Perspectives aren't quite what they should be. There's Cowley Village, St David's Station probably here. Cowley Bridge is there, that's the bridge. And there seems to be a big building here, which is possibly Cowley Bridge Station. And there's a train coming by, steam coming out. And the scene isn't very different even today. So he got it more or less right. So the Cowley Bridge booking office was taken down, but they reused it, re-erected it at new size apparently. It was burnt down later. But interestingly, the ground on which the station was built, according to the property plans, that was sold very much later on. That little parcel of land was still in railway possession until I'm not quite sure when, but I couldn't read the conveyance date there. But yes, that's another plan that Mark Howells produced. So eventually, it was leased to the Bristol and Exeter. One track was converted back to broad gauge, and a junction was opened to the Bristol and Exeter Railway initially with only one track. There was originally a timber bridge was built over the River Exe, but that had become a bit decrepit. So that was then replaced with a single line bridge. It's bizarre, all this. Rather than the double line bridge. So we finished up with this. And I don't know how clear that is, but it's just something for your PWI guys. Work this out. You've got, by this time it's mixed gauge. You've got mixed gauge on the down line, superimposed with, I'm talking about down line down towards Crediton, because it's up, the up line goes the other way towards Taunton. So you've got four rails here coming together with a junction. How does that work? Well, what it is that left-hand rail is the common rail for broad and mixed gauge going towards Crediton. That rail is the rail going towards Crediton for the standard gauge. Coming the other way, that's the common rail for both. And that is the standard gauge rail going towards Exeter. Of course, the reason is that at the stations, you always wanted the common rail on the platform. So I would love to have seen how the junction, where the two split, the other side of the bridge. Unfortunately, I haven't got any plans of that. But I mean, that really is a brilliant piece of permanent way, isn't it? There were inevitably derailments and some interesting inspectors' reports and so on about the junction being too sharp and so on. But eventually, they got around to adding another track to the bridge and a full proper mixed gauge junction so that the LSWR could run through from Queen Street Station. And that's actually another rather funny photograph, but that is a different view of the double line bridge as it was eventually finished up, having been strengthened and extra trestles put underneath it. So in the end, they got there, got to Crediton, mixed gauge days, and then later on, North Devon Line to Plymouth opened all the way through, and that was where we finished up with the general layout of the lines in North East Devon. But no flooding problems. The London Evening News reported on serious flooding at Cowley and washouts at the junction. And so it's quite interesting that here you've got, presumably after the flood, you've got a P-way gang here, relaying track. You've got chaps doing something about the embankment. You've got a relaying train, perhaps very primitive. Quite an interesting picture. But unfortunately, the artist wasn't very good at representing the single line bridge over the floodplain here. It looks more like a fence, I think. And it looks like the landowners planted some nice little trees here. A bit of, with fences round against the rabbits. A lovely picture. But the problem was that the only outlet for water coming down on the right-hand side of the line was this small culvert, which the Bristol and Exeter had built just north of the junction, 8-foot span, still there, of course. And that's all there was to relieve the flooding, which was mainly overtopping the railway up the line, coming down this side. This little old small flood culvert here coming out under the bridge to of the line to Crediton, but an extra one had been added in 1896 by the Great Western to try and to get the water away more quickly, and that's known as the downstream culvert. But the old one was the upstream culvert, and Mark very kindly provided me with a photograph actually inside the downstream culvert, which was a lot bigger than the old culvert. So those were the typical 20th century winter flood conditions, which continued right the way through from, let's say, that 1898 extra culvert, and that was still pertaining at the beginning of the 60s. Interestingly, the junction, trains from Paddington to Plymouth went through the junction heading south. But trains from Plymouth to London Waterloo went through the junction heading north. So this one actually is heading south, but it's going to Plymouth, not London. It was always a bit of a conundrum, that one, but there we go. But then October 1960, there was the Exeter flood disaster. It really was horrendous. I mean, this is the state that things were in the centre of Exeter. So, and that was the flooding downstream from Cowley. I mean, it was just a complete, ocean. But the trains got through somehow. You could do it with steam in those days. So these guys are looking a bit apprehensive here. I bet they had to get out of the way to get their feet out of the wash on the train as it went through. But so the a report was commissioned from McDonald's and Partners by the Devon River Board to report on what could be done to alleviate the flooding. And part of that was proposals for realigning the River Exe at Cowley, and various options were considered. I won't go into any detail, but you can see that there's alternatives there. But that was the one that was eventually, does that look a bit washed out? Is that all right? Yeah. But that was the one that was adopted with the X alongside the railway diverged away from the railway, but back under the original course. A couple of new bridges here, one for the X, what was called the Mill Leet Bridge, which would then replace these very decrepit bridges, the one over the X, a couple of bridges here, one at Backwater, one at Front Reef Channel, and the one up here for the Leet. And of course, in those days, it was a British Transport Commission. So, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button here again. I've done it again. I've done something silly with the buttons. Sorry, Philip.
That's all right, don't worry.
There's all this technology.
All right,
there.
do that, and that should be
All
started.
right, okay, right. So those were the proposals at the time, but then came this gentleman in 1963, and the proposals were for the whole of the lines from Exeter, sort of northwestwards, to be closed. But after huge opposition, the line to Barnstable was reprieved. The line to Oakhampton, that was reprieved, well, actually through to Lidford until 68. Well, you can see the dates there. Melbourne Quarry was kept open until 2011. But eventually, the whole line was closed from Cowley Junction here through to Lidford by 2011. So that's where we were by 1965. We had double line bridges from the junction, Bridge 534, which is the old long wrought iron bridge, all these other various bridges which were getting very ancient. So it was decided that British Railways would do the work to replace them with new bridges on the alignment proposed in the McDonald report. A new one for the River Exe, fill in the old channels, new one for what we call the Mill Leet coming from the waterworks, connecting accommodation bridge, channel, sort of balancing channel between the two, a nice new wide channel. And that is actually what finally, sorry, I've done it again. I keep pressing the wrong bloody button.
Just take the slide up on the screen, the forward one. Yeah.
Right.
There you
Go backwards now.
So in those days, it was still, it's become British Railways rather than British Transport Commission. It was Southern Region. So they engaged consultants, Mott Hen Anderson, to carry out the design work, because they didn't do that sort of thing very much in the Southern Region in those days. And then they invited the tenders in the early 65, and they let a contract for construction to Kier Construction. And then in June, the North Devon lines are transferred to the Western Region. So the CC Paddington became responsible, and our then Chief Civil Engineer, Benny Barnwell, said, well, we don't know anything about this job, better get Mott Hayes to supervise it. Then they realised that Mott Hayes didn't have any experience of railway construction. So they needed a Western Region Western engineer to work in conjunction with them to oversee the railway engineering side, arrange the possessions, and to liaise with Hayes RE. And I got involved. So I was invited to go to Devon. Invitation difficult to refuse. A lovely piece of countryside, and I spent 15 months down there on unusual work for railway engineering, replica versions, new bridges, automated versions, all sorts of stuff. Great fun. So eventually the contract was let, or to start in December of 1965. But unfortunately, there was a washout at the junction. We couldn't do anything at all. Site access was delayed by a local landowner who was insisting on all sorts of compensations and so on. But eventually we started in February, and that was what it looked like when we started. Well, that was a bit before that in the December. That was the junction. Not many trees about. It's surprising how things have grown. That was the old bridge, and the downline had been filled with stone dust to create a contractor's road, and the upline from Crediton to Exeter was singled so that we could carry out the work with just single line working. Interestingly, have I done it again? No. The original course of the River Exe is actually visible here in this photograph. The singled upline and stone dust infill to create a road. The original course of the River Exe here again, snaking around under the bridge. And this is these are the two bridges where well, close to this was where the lavatory was on the gents. And fortunately, they were all these bridges were two separate bridges because the line had been doubled at different time, which made it a lot easier for the work to be carried out to be able to demolish one side without affecting the other. Also for infilling, it meant that the longitudinal rail bearers could carry the load of the contractor's vehicles and so on. That was the one, the furthest north, the mill meet. Again, you can see quite clearly before construction there. And also wagons standing on the contractor's siding. So that was our site. It was over half a mile long, 700 meters long, single line, not very easy for major civil engineering works for bridge renewal, but we managed, and it turned out to be quite an interesting job. That was a site compound next to Upton Vine Bridge, and again, keep pressing the wrong bloody button. That was a contractor's access road, a bit further into the jog, got a bit muddy. Oh, and very handy, Cowley Bridge Inn, we had some temporary accommodation. The Martin Hayes Clerk of Works decided to negotiate with the landlord to level a piece of ground and create an access off the Stoke Road. A few loads of stone from the contractor and a track excavator managed that. And so he suggested, well, why don't you get a caravan as well, save lodgings? And strange enough, we both caravans almost exactly the same. Very convenient. All the facilities were there, you know, loo in the backyard, and yeah, enough said. It looks a bit different today. So we started eventually in February. Diesel pile hammer, banging in piles, night possessions, not very acceptable. So lots of complaints. So we finished up doing Sunday possessions. Some of the piles are so close to the line, we actually had to tip the rails out to get the piles in, pull the sleepers back. That's me there. Then get the track back together and ready for Monday morning. The cofferdam excavation is going on here. Oh, that's Kia's site engineer. Not very interested in the work, I don't think. It's a nice chap. The excavation continued with 5 miles an hour working. That's a Plymouth to Brighton service. And there's the excavator busying away. No problems, you know, so everybody happy. Don't think we'd get away with that these days. Cofferdams are dug, the strutting and framing. Oh, and then one of the cofferdams got to about 6 meters down, and there's this huge, great tree trunk, about 1.5 meters diameter. How long it had been there, how many hundreds of years, I don't know, but obviously, well, might have been thousands of years. But that took 2 or 3 days to cut through and get it out, because every time you cut a slot in it, it closed up because it was expanding. And I don't know what they did with the tree trunk. I'm sure the local archaeologists would have stopped all work for about three weeks to examine it. But so we got the cofferdams completed, very close to the line, some of them, passing DMU over the top. It all worked, and nothing fell in. All the concrete for the job was batched on site. They set up no ready mix at all. They set up a proper batching plant and so on for it. Oh, and I was there helping out with the local Clerk of Works, Motnose Clerk of Works, curing and crushing cubes and so on. It's great, you know, really good experience. The abutments and piers were constructed in the cofferdams. That's a bad slide, isn't it? And then it came to the steelwork, and that was fabricated in Exeter at Red Hoo's Steelworks down beyond St Thomas Station. The steelworks isn't actually on that plan, but that's where it was, in Water Lane. And that was delivered by road. They brought it in off the Crediton Road. Oh, and that's interesting, because in the background there's a scraper there, actually starting to get the topsoil off, ready for digging the channels. So still was erected between trains, and well, there's a Hymac going past on the ballast train whilst work has paused up on the Millleap Bridge. We had a tractor's temporary level crossing, all very sophisticated. We had a telephone, crossing keepers there having a chat, but trains were limited in speed, no great problems. Things are different in those days. Another fuzzy one, I'm afraid, but that's a dumper delivering concrete for the deck of the one of the bridges. And keep doing this. What do I do?
Yeah.
And concreting the deck of the River Exe Bridge. Note the PPE, health and safety. Nobody got hurt, but lovely sunny day though. And eventually the bridge decks and the formation were ready for track leg. It looks a bit primitive through here, but it was okay. And there was a single line turnout was laid at the beyond the Millleap Bridge in a few, and eventually it was connected. Well, initially it was connected back into the up line, so that whilst we were finishing the work, trades could continue to come down the single line connection from just beyond the bridge. I meant to say that there was a temporary ground frame beyond Upton Pine Bridge, where the trains went from double to single line working. So they could then continue to use the single line and then come back onto the new down line until the work was finished. So it was the new track was laid and ballasted, and opened for use. So we could take out the old upline was lifted, got rid of, which oh, and it's quite interesting. Both bridges were double span, so of course the two spans had to have different skews to suit the track curvature. So that was fairly tricky when the joint between the two spans was interesting. Topsoil stripping carried on, but with a few interruptions. The tractor driver, the D8 driver, was a bit full at the gate, and he didn't anticipate the slightly wetter conditions in parts of the site. But eventually, we got around to digging the new channels. The spore was moved by drag line and carted away by six-wheel drive dumpers. They had to have six-wheel drive stuff because they kept bogging down otherwise. And the spore was excavated from under the new bridges, and the dragline bucket isn't about to knock the cab off the track excavator. That's an unfortunate piece of perspective. So we dug out under the bridges, pulled out the sheet piling, and River X channel was dug. And stone pitching was required for the bend in the River X to prepare the scour. And that was completed stone pitching. Nice job, all pitched by hand, required by the Devon River Authority. They wouldn't tell us what they wanted. They said, well, you do it and we'll approve it. But yeah, typical. And sheet piling was driven to retain the embankment downstream of the bridge. And then there was the problem of the water main. There were existing twin water mains that ran from the waterworks down to Crediton Road. And unfortunately, the existing mains ran straight down across where the new cut for the River X was due to be. Now we were held up by this because there was a delay on the delivery of the water mains, of the pipes for the water main, and we were very pushed because all this topsoil had been, the excavated material had been stacked from the new channels that was going to go into the old channels. That had to be got rid of by the end of October before the flood season. So it was all a bit of a rush. But eventually, we got the water mains diversion done. As I say, this is rather out of the normal realm of railway civil engineering. 18-inch or 450 millimeter twin water mains, high pressure water mains. 500 meters of it were laid. I'm sorry, I keep doing this. I keep getting the wrong button. And where they went under the railway, they rather cleverly used the old piers with the dry span bridge 535. I'm sorry. Why can't we have these buttons next to each other? And of course, there were thrust blocks needed at all the turns and so on because of the high pressure. And that's the finished pipe culvert under the existing line. New pipe crossing over the balancing channel next to Crediton Road. And that's which was the, God, sorry, I keep doing it. The little cottage that we thought might have been part of the step, but in fact that was the toll house, not the station building. And that's where we sort of finished up with, we also had to replace, we had to build 2 accommodation bridges over the new cut to connect these fields, one there, one there. And also there was a flat valve here to stop backflow into the water mains, into the waterworks. with a flat valve channel, and the water mains are carried on the accommodation bridge. That's the one downstream of Mill Leap. Enormous span, but it worked. And that's the one over the balancing channel with the flat valve channel here, and the brackets to accommodate the water mains. We had to, before we could fill the old channels, we had to dewater them, and we had 4-inch pumps running 24 hours a day to keep the old channels dry. And pumping them out, we had to return the fish to the river, most of them. There was quite a lot of fresh salmon on the local restaurant, so that couple of weeks. But we got there in the end. And in order to fill in the old channels, we had to erect Bailey bridges over the new channels to get to where the fill had to be brought in. And in fact, we had to bring in an extra 25,000 cubic meters of fill to actually fill in the old channels, and that's the old X channel being filled with the accommodation bridge giving us access. So yeah, those are the Bailey bridges. Get it right in a minute. It was interesting. This is the photograph I offered to you, Malcolm, to identify. I knew what they were doing, but I was interested in the vehicles that were being used, because in order to fill in the old X bridge, the easiest way was to bring in trains on the contractor siding from Malden Quarry, where I persuaded, I think it was Mr. Weaver, who was the quarry manager, to provide us with some very convenient hopper wagons. And he actually red carded a couple of the southern regions 40-ton or whatever their walruses, so that we could snaffle those, because they had much more capacity than the dogfish. So a combination of dogfishes, walruses, and some side-tipping mermaid wagons, we were actually able to fill in by taking up the decking. This was at night for about 6 weeks. I was working ghosters, I made a fortune. Taking up the decking and guys opening the chutes, and sometimes it was so compacted we were there prodding with bars and so on to get the stuff to run. Eventually we were able to fill up the channel by discharging stone dust through the deck. But fortunately, with the cross girders having taken up the decking, we were able to do it. And as we went along, so the sheet piling was driven to retain the stone dust. Again, some quite interesting health and safety going on here. We did have a safety boat in case anybody fell in, but nobody got wet. So eventually we got that filled in. You can see the stone dust fill here, and demolished the old upside span. You can see these. You couldn't demolish these; they were full of concrete. And these are the extra strengthening that was put in the early 20th century, the additional trestles. But before we could, sorry, I keep doing this. Oh, press the wrong button. Have I?
Should be all right.
Oh, there we go. We had to extend the upstream culvert because that discharged under the old bridge. So that was another piece of interesting work. Precast concrete box culvert to extend it. I can't remember quite how we cut through the sheet piling without everybody getting wet. I can't remember how that was done, but it was achieved anyway. So that was the old downline span awaiting the had disappeared. Sorry, the upline span had disappeared. The upline track was waiting removal. And so formation was topped up again at night with stone dust, and the cross girders were cut away were disconnected from the main girders. You can actually see the guy here actually with an oxyacetylene torch. And bear in mind that this steel that was coated in tar and salt. God knows. The smoke was still horrendous, but I don't know whether this guy is still alive. The cross girders were actually left in the formation because there's no way of getting them out. So the main girders were removed, carried away by rail, and the plain line completed, and the contractor siding was removed, and the double line was restored, and that was 1967 with it all nicely, neatly done. Contractor's compound all nicely topsoiled and reinstated, and that was the finished view from Cowley Bridge, all very neat and tidy, but a little bit different from today. I don't know why all that stuff grows, but it's amazing, isn't it? So that was the situation then by 1970, where we had the single double line junction just north of the Milwick Bridge, the replacement bridges, the old bridge filled in, the new River-Ex Bridge, which is of course the one that's there now. The River-Ex diverted away from the old line, balancing channel, diverted Milwick and so on, and a single line junction at Cowley Bridge. But then they decided that there still wasn't good enough. They wanted to do more improvements at Cowley Bridge. So hydraulics research were commissioned to do another study at Cowley. So they built a model at Wallingford, just near where I live, and they modelled it. There's Cowley Bridge, you just see the little arches. It's Cowley Bridge Junction with a line going off to Taunton, that's the credited line, and these are the rivers going down to Exeter Weir and so on. And they finished up recommending some more river works, all quite elaborate. Berms alongside the river channels. The Mill-Leat channel being widened out and connected directly into the from the River-Ex rather than all this business for balancing channel. The accommodation bridges removed and widened and replaced. They wanted to change the crest levels and weirs. It was all very elaborate, when in fact it wasn't all done. What was done was simply to create a much wider flood channel, taking advantage of the much wider spans of the new Milwick Bridge, the 1965 bridge, and replacing the old accommodation bridges with some more new ones, much closer to the railway line. And I don't quite know what happened to the water mains diversion, but they must have done work here as well. So that sort of more up to where we are now. And that's one of the new accommodation bridges over the wider Milwick Channel. But there are still the problems of the water flowing down the wrong side of the line. Still hadn't been sorted. Pretty flooded this side, but completely over the top of the junction, which has always been the problem. And of course, the problem was at Stafford Bridge, and it's Stafford Bridge, not Stafford's Bridge, I might say. And that's the original timber trestle bridge, which was built by the Bristol and Exeter, replaced by Still Bridge in 1905. And The problem, of course, was the water overflowing the flood banks here at Stafford Bridge when it got to a certain level, coming down the wrong side and overwhelming the junction. The flood banks at Stafford Bridge, they've recently been repaired and raised to back to their proper level. But unfortunately, December 2012, as you all remember, we had this massive flood because once the water gets a certain level, it can't be allowed to go above the bottom flanges of Stafford Bridge because there's bridge stability. So it has to flow down the wrong side of the line. And so that's where we had the aqueduct inflatable barriers and so on, and all a bit of a disaster. So it's quite apparent that the existing culverts that we have, the old upstream and downstream culverts, which are over here. There were some pipe culverts which are put in, barely see them. That's what they looked like last summer. They were put in 2000, I think it was, just here, just about to see them in the aerial photo. They obviously couldn't cope, so this is where the new box culverts were decided to be built, which you've probably read about. So in 2018, 75-hour blockade. I think it was pretty good to do this in 3 days. The line was closed, embankment excavated away, stone backfill for the culvert foundations because the ground wasn't very good there. I'll come to that in a bit. Box units imported from Westmeath in Southern Ireland. God knows why, but there we are. Very good job. Shane Murtagh, they were called. Wing walls, they were constructed before the track possession, so all they had to do was dig out, drop the culverts in, that's all. And those are the completed culverts. Track was put back. Only took 75 hours. I think they're getting pretty good at this stuff. Aprons and rock mattresses upstream, that was specially designed to stop scour, spillway into the River Ex, and there's the Tarka Line Bridge, the one we built in 66. And that's the completed culvert. Very nice job. Quite big they are. Give you an idea, that was me having walked through and back from them. But the interesting thing is you can actually see from the aerial photographs in the crop marks the original course of the River Ex. Where does it come? Right to where the culverts are. So it's not really surprising that they had bad ground here. They chose exactly the right place to put them, but they had a lot of problem with the ground. Stafford Bridge, they've instituted a river level monitoring installation so that they can get prior warning rather than having to have a watchman out there, prior warning when the river levels are getting dodgy. And then, of course, this is Mark Howell's defence barrier scheme, which was put in 2020 to mitigate the problems of future flood barriers. There's a flood defence barrier erected. And since then, all these extra things have been put in. The electrical signaling equipment has been raised above flood level, improved the track stability. They've got the emergency ballast stockpile at Riverside Yard. Oh, which incidentally, I added 3 tracks to that as another contract whilst I was down at Exeter doing the Cowley Bridge. Well, that was another bicycle job. And then, well, contingency plans. So in 1840, we had 2 roads, 2 rivers, and no railways. But now we've got 2 rivers, 2 roads and 2 railways. Cowley Bridge is still there. That hasn't changed at all. Exeter Waterworks has changed quite substantially. And of course, the dear old Cowley Bridge Inn, still there, but just about recognisable. Afraid it's closed now. It's a shame. So that was Cowley Bridge Junction. Is that a scene from the past, or is there more to come? So that is more or less the summary of the situation as we've come to it.
No. Good. Okay, excellent.
So, well, now we've got this video, if we have time, do we?
Yeah, there's plenty of
Yes,
time.
oh, good.
You want to do any questions at the moment on what you said?
Yeah, well, any questions? Yeah, yes, why not? Yeah.
Any, Mark?
Excellent talk, thank you. Very clear, very interesting. The photographs are amazing. And, I didn't realise there were so many photographs of that work. So yeah, really the question I have is around the track possessions and handling that between traffic. There was a 5 mile an hour TSR line, presumably, all the way through. What were the operators like in terms of operations partners at the time? Were they quite vociferous about opening the line back up on Monday morning when you ran late, or did you run late? What was their general attitude?
Very cooperative. There was a signalman at Cowley Bridge Junction. They were quite happy with the operating side, and well, the local permanent way inspector, Jack Oaten at Exeter, he was a bit of a stickler, but he was quite happy with what was going on. He knew that the track was not going to be in any way jeopardized as far as its stability was concerned, because, well, we knew that there was an engineering person on site, and 5 miles an hour, you know, pretty easy, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it was just left to take possession when we needed it. I would go up to the signal box, do the usuals, see the levers are on the handles, the sleeves are on the handles, and it just all worked very smoothly. There was no signing of, well, yes, you'd sign the train register, but things were done properly, but without a great deal of administration and form filling and side covering, quite honestly. And it just all worked. We all worked together because the people doing the engineering understood the operating, and the operating people understood the engineering side of things. So it all worked very, very smooth. I don't remember there ever been any problems. Whilst we were doing the infilling of the X Bridge with the train of hopper waxed and so on, periodically, because the tail of the train was hanging over the junction, we had to pull clear because the night mail was due. So the signalman would wander up the line from the box and say, night mail's due in 20 minutes, can you pull up? So, okay, pull up, clear it, and he would let the train through. It was as simple as that. And then, you know, once that was done, I'd go down to the box to see the train through and say, right, you can take the road again.
I think it's fair to say we could learn a lot from that, make things simpler and overcomplicate things. So, I was hoping that's the answer you were going to give, and
Yeah.
reassuring that we've done it before.
Yes,
Do it again.
yeah.
Thank you.
Can I elaborate on that?
Yes.
Partly answering what you were just saying there, Mark. I remember talking to Nick Millington recently, and he was talking about the app. There will be a better way to, whatever it looks like, where it's broadly similar, where you just tap on the app and I take possession, press the button, and someone the possession, press the button again. So it's coming back. It's interesting how in the railway things come full circle quite regularly, isn't it? So just a point of note then.
Yeah, well, in those days, it was our railway. we all belonged to the same organisation.
Mm.
And we all understood what each other were doing and trying to achieve. It wasn't us with a contractor trying to do something for this person on their railway and interfering with their trains or somebody else's trains. They were all worked for the railways, and it was all in the railways' interest to run the trains and to keep things safe. So it wasn't all divided up into 101 different entities. So I'm afraid you can blame John Major for where we are now.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, should we hit the film?
There's no questions from online, so.
Yeah, I will say that since we made the video, more information has come to light through the Broad Gauge Society, which is a very interesting organisation. It's run by a canon somebody, so you can, it's very focused on broad gauge, a little bit obsessional. But they did actually send me some of their broadsheets, which I thought were just going to be little information sheets. They're wonderful magazines on all sorts of stuff on the broad gauge, how to model broad gauge locomotives and so on. But that's where I got a lot of the information about the temporary station at Cowley Bridge and the alterations at Cowley Bridge Junction with some of those lovely photographs. So quite interested. Anyway, so that stuff isn't included in the video, but John and I had a lot of fun making it last summer.
Is there sound on the video?
Yes. It's about 35 minutes.
Okay.
So
Yeah, it's on the stage. We've got to play it on here to put it up there. But why have we got that? Where's that come from?
there were two items on the stick. One is this.
Did you put the memory sticks through there?
Yeah. No, it's not.
USB drive, okay, so that is it. That's the video.
That's not come up on Probably going to do it for the others.
I'm going to pause that briefly. I'm going to restart that so we can synchronize that. I'm going to mute this. Can you mute this broadcasting from my computer, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you mute that one, I will press go on the broadcasting one and this computer at the same time.
Between 1841 and 1844, a railway line was built from Bristol to Exeter. As it approached the final few miles into the city, a low area of land needed to be crossed. This area is where the rivers Creedy and Exe meet at Cowley Bridge and was always notorious for flooding in winter. Initially, only the main line passed along the valley floor, but in 1847 a line to Crediton branched off and headed north. The meanders of the River Exe were straightened when the Bristol and Exeter Railway was built, causing floodwaters to concentrate at Cowley Bridge Junction, where the two railways met. Often the floods would rise over the line, washing out the ballast and damaging line-side equipment. With the increasing risk of flooding and the line closures which resulted, something had to be done to limit the frequency of these events and improve the resilience of the railway against flood damage. This programme will discuss the changes that have been made to the rivers at Cowley and the measures put in place since the disastrous Exeter City floods of December 1960 and subsequent flood events. Richard Watts was the BR Western Region resident engineer on site during work carried out in the mid-1960s to reduce the effect of the seasonal rise in water levels. Although this project was essentially a bridge replacement scheme, the river's course was the key driver to the direction of this project.
The course of the River Exe before the railways came was nowhere near where it is now. It used to meander across the floodplain at Cowley and then join the River Creedy north of where it joins it now, and then flow through the three-spanned Cowley Bridge behind me here, gives the area its name, which was built in 1813 or 14, long before the railways. The 1836 Bristol and Exeter Parliamentary Plan shows where the River Exe and the subsidiary watercourses ran in the early 19th century. And on the 1900 Ordnance Survey, the city boundary line, highlighted in red, still followed the original course of the river. When the Bristol and Exeter was built, they diverted the Exe to run on the northwest side of the new railway for about 1 kilometre. They also constructed Cowley Weir, a balancing channel from above the weir to Cowley Bridge, a widened channel southwest to join the original main river, and the Brunel Arch Bridge over it to carry the Crediton Road, which had to be realigned and raised to suit. The North Devon line was completed in 1847 by the Exeter and Crediton Railway Company as a double line with broad gauge track of 7.25 feet. That's over 2 meters wide. The only example of broad gauge track with signals, locomotives and rolling stock nowadays is at Didcot Railway Centre in Oxfordshire, who very kindly let us visit as they prepared for their annual events just before Christmas. At first, there was no connection to the Bristol and Exeter line, but a temporary station was built at Cowley Bridge. A contemporary oil painting shows a building in the valley on the far left, close to the railway line, possibly a temporary station. The London and South Western Railway, the principal shareholder, had the tracks converted to 4 foot 8.5 standard gauge, planning to build a separate line from Cowley to their Queen Street station in Exeter. But the gauge commissioners decreed that the track must be broad gauge, so the line and the station at Cowley Bridge remained unused. The station was probably sited in this field, between the present line to Crediton and Barnstaple and the Crediton Road, and the entrance may have been where this cottage now stands. Eventually, the railway was opened in May 1851, operated by the Bristol and Exeter, with one track converted back to broad gauge and a single line junction at Cowley later converted to double line. The temporary wooden station was dismantled and re-erected at Newton St Sires. Finally, in 1860, the LSWR reached an agreement with the Bristol and Exeter for a connection from its Queen Street station, now Exeter Central, to St David's, with mixed gauge track from there to Cowley Bridge Junction, and a lease of the line to Crediton and onwards to the North Devon Railway and Barnstaple. The LSWR line crossed the Exe immediately north of Cowley Bridge Junction on a curved multi-span wrought iron bridge 75 metres long, which was widened to 2 tracks in 1879. North of this, across the floodplain, were 3 other bridges. These spanned the original course of the River Exe and a flood opening next to it, and a bridge over the Mill Leat about 650 metres north of the junction. The railways began to experience problems from seasonal flooding, and in January 1886 the Illustrated London News reported major disruption at Cowley Bridge. Following the construction of the Bristol and Exeter, there was a tendency in times of flood for water to flow down towards Cowley Bridge Junction on the east side of the railway. A culvert through the embankment that had been built upstream of Cowley Weir proved too small, so it was augmented by the GWR in 1896 by a larger culvert downstream of the weir. Often these culverts would be insufficient, causing floodwater to overtop the embankment and severely disrupt train services.
Well, we're standing on the Crediton Road Bridge over the railway at Cowley Bridge Junction, and you can see that the Barnstable line is going off to the left, single line, and the Paddington line is coming down from the right as the Great Western Main Line double line. To the left of the railway, that's where Cowley Bridge Junction signal box used to be. Beyond it, the grey railings, that's the outlet from what we call the downstream culvert, which runs from round about where that grey box is by the pub, diagonally across the railway to let the floodwater out from the right-hand side of the track across to the main River Exe. Beyond the 80-mile-an-hour restriction sign, you can see some more grey railings. That's what we call the upstream culvert, which is built by Brunel, which is the only outlet into the River Exe before the Barnstable line was built.
By the early 1960s, the railways and the rivers at Cowley had changed little for over 100 years. But the 4 bridges north of Cowley Bridge Junction on the Barnstable line required reconstruction or replacement. After the Exeter floods of December 1960, a flood relief scheme at Cowley was developed by the Devon River Board and the British Transport Commission, following proposals by consultants MacDonald and Partners in November 1961. 2 new double-line bridges would replace the 4 bridges, with diversions of the watercourses to improve the flow of the River Exe and protect the waterworks installations, which had come to within 60 millimetres of danger level during the flooding. The proposals were completed by December 1962, but an earlier Transport Act had created the new British Railways Board in 1963, and there followed the infamous Beeching Report. At first, the North Devon lines were threatened with complete closure, but following much opposition, the Barnstable line was reprieved. The Plymouth route also survived, but eventually closed beyond Meldon Quarry in 1968. To save costs, it was decided to single the line and the new bridges for approximately 500 metres from the junction. Detailed design was carried out by Mott Hen Anderson for British Railways Southern Region, and a contract was let to Keir Construction. But before work could commence, the North Devon line was transferred to the Western Region. So for continuity, the contract was supervised by Mott Hay, with a Western Region resident engineer responsible for the railway engineering and operating aspects. Work started late 1965. The up line towards Exeter had been singled for 800 metres, so that the new bridges could be built on the down line, which was converted into a temporary contractor's siding. A temporary signal cabin just north of Upton Pine Overbridge controlled the connections back into the double track and into the contractor's siding. The contractor rented the adjacent field for his compound, and a convenient site for the resident engineer and clerk of works living caravans was provided at the Cowley Bridge Inn by Don and Kath Hooper, who made the workers very welcome. The down line was spread up to rail level with stone dust delivered by train from Meldon Quarry to provide an access road throughout the site from the contractor's compound. Work proper was delayed by an objector to the scheme who owned part of the worksite and refused access to his land. The contractor finally paid him a generous sum for access with comprehensive indemnity against damage to his livestock, grazing and fishing. Construction eventually started in February 1966 during night track closures, driving steel sheet piling for 6 cofferdams for the new bridge abutments and piers using a diesel pile hammer. In places this involved tipping out the rails and pulling back the sleepers, but after noise complaints this was changed to Sunday daytime closures for driving the piles closest to the line. The remainder were driven during weekdays between trains, and the cofferdams were excavated using back-actors and grabs, with framing and strutting fixed as excavation progressed. The cofferdams were up to 7 metres deep, excavated into the shale bedrock and continuously dewatered using diesel pumps, not always successfully. Where track sleepers had been trimmed to accommodate the piles, passing trains overhung the excavations. At the bottom of one of the cofferdams, a large tree trunk was found, needing several days to cut through the saturated timber and lift it out by crane. A mixing plant in the site compound produced all the concrete for the new abutments and piers in the cofferdams, and it was transported by dumper trucks using the temporary access road alongside the running line. Trains were limited to 5 miles an hour and vehicles would stop when they were passing. Steelwork for the bridge spans was fabricated by Red Hugh Engineering at their works in Water Lane near Exeter St Thomas Station. Robert Hopkins started his career as an apprentice with Red Hughes in 1966, the year work began on the bridges.
It was, yeah, it was heavy stuff, and it was an eye-opener actually, from leaving metalwork at school to this, and the bridges, I'd never seen anything made like that in my life.
After the steel was delivered, I understand you used to have a hell of a job getting it out of here on these corners.
When it was big, long stuff, the police would put up signs up and warn everybody in the street they were going to back out of there and then drive up the road.
Yeah.
And a few times, a lady from that Cockfield Street laid in front of the vehicles. They wouldn't let them in, wouldn't let them out, and we had some fun then, and everybody come outside and looked and laughed and clapped, and that was it. That's how it went. Yeah. That was it.
Were you involved in the actual erection of the steelwork at Cowley?
No,
That was a special...
I was too young at the time. But we used to go to college 1 day a week, day release.
Yes, yeah.
And Mac McCarthy, he was a manager, and he took us for lessons as well, because we were learning to be platers, that's the thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was, in my mind, a plater and a fabricator are 2 different things. A plater can get rid of a drawing, do what's on the drawing, where the fabricator gets a part sent to him, and he puts them together. And that's it's like a jigsaw puzzle.
It was generally a happy place to work.
Oh, it was all right. Yeah. It was brilliant.
It was always the leg pulls and the cracks.
Oh, you've seen that. I mean, when you was out, the worst thing when you come out your time, you knew you was going to get painted and greased up and everything, and they don't even do that no more. I mean, that's part of it.
The bridges are still there.
They are, yeah.
Thanks very much for all the memories.
Well, I got some good memories of that place, and some lovely men, and all the men that used to work in there. I'll tell you what, you couldn't beat a better bunch than that. You couldn't. They was all right, and they learned. They taught me a lot.
Steelwork was delivered by road and the bridge components brought in across the field from the Crediton Road. Red Hughes works to install the steelwork had to pause between trains, and as you can see here, a ballast train from Meldon Quarry approaches the Mill Loop Bridge. After the steelwork had been erected, the reinforced concrete bridge decks were cast in situ. The decks were then waterproofed, bridges 535 and 536 were removed and filled in, and the formation prepared for the new single line. This is the bridge on the Barnstable line that we built over the Mill Leat. It's a few hundred yards north of Cowley Bridge Junction. Looking a bit tatty, it doesn't look as if it's been painted since we built it 55 years ago. But it's still there, and the piers look okay. Can't see the abutments very well, but it seems to have survived. So Red Hugh Engineering did a fairly good job, I think. A single to double line turnout had been installed just north of the Mill Leap Bridge, so that the new track could be laid in over the completed structures, with a temporary connection back into the up line. Fred Butler was a member of the crew on the first train one Sunday morning in August. They went out on the old line with an excursion to Barnstable hauled by a high-mech diesel loco driven by Walt Thomas. On the way back, they were warned by Ernie Barryball, the ballast train driver, that they'd have a rough ride over the newly ballasted track and the two new bridges. The track had only just been connected up. The redundant section of the old up line was removed so that the new river channels could be excavated under the bridges. Earthworks had already started, but not without problems stripping the topsoil. Excavation was carried out by dragline, with 6-wheel drive dumpers to carry away the spoil to temporary stockpiles. A trackscavator removed the sheet piles from under the bridges, and where the X-channel curved round under the new bridge, the sides and bottom were lined with stone pitching to prevent scour. On the left bank, alongside the railway, a sheet-piled wall was constructed in stages to retain the new embankment and track where the old X-bridge was to be filled in. 6-inch pumps running 24 hours a day kept the excavations dry. And when the old channels were pumped out before they were filled in, most of the fish left stranded in the final half-metre or so of water were returned to the river. However, fresh salmon appeared on the menus of a number of local restaurants that week in 1966. Meanwhile, 2 accommodation bridges were constructed, one to cross the Millleat, the other to cross the new balancing channel below the flap valve sluice wall. The bridge over the balancing channel was fitted with brackets on the parapets for diverted water mains, and the sluice wall below it incorporated flap valves to prevent backflow into the waterworks turbine outlets. 2 450mm diameter water mains from the waterworks ran underground southwestwards to the Crediton Road. For much of their length they followed the line of the new River Exe channel, so 500 metres of replacement cast iron mains had to be laid on a new alignment from near the new flap valve sluice wall to the Crediton Road. Where they went under the railway, a pipe culvert was built between the redundant piers of Bridge 535, and a new pipe crossing was provided spanning the balancing channel adjacent to the road. In addition to the material excavated from the new river channels, an extra 230,000 cubic metres of fill were imported. Temporary Bailey bridges were erected for earth-moving vehicles whilst filling in the old channels and to provide access for demolishing the old ex-railway bridge. The Brunel upstream culvert under the mainline embankment was extended with a concrete box structure cast in situ between the casings which had supported the old bridge. The old channel was then filled in and restored to ground level. The embankment under the down half of the ex-railway bridge had been created during construction of the sheet pile wall by discharging meld and stone dust through the bridge deck from 40-ton hopper wagons and side tippers during night track closures in late 1966. The fill was topped up to formation level and the rails and longitudinal bearers removed and replaced with plain line track. Later, the main girders were cut into sections and loaded away by rail, leaving the cross girders buried in the embankment. On completion of the work, the contractor's compound was dismantled and the field reinstated. The remainder of the contractor's siding and access road was removed and Bridge 537 demolished and filled in, enabling double track to be reinstated north of the new single to double line connection, although the line has since been singled throughout. Finally, the ground frame at Upton Pine was removed and control transferred to Cowley Bridge Junction signal box. From here, you can see approximately where it's alleged that a temporary station was built, probably just a simple platform with some red carpet on, for Queen Victoria when she visited Lord Eardsley, who was then her Chancellor of the Exchequer, who lived then at Pines House. And the bridge, you can see, is carrying Pines Hill up towards Upton Pine over the Crediton line. And the station would have been just sort of to the right of that tree trunk of the pine tree. Flooding continued to affect the Cowley area, and in 1972 the Devon River Authority engaged the Hydraulics Research Station at Wallingford to construct a hydraulic model of Cowley and its environs. This was to examine conditions on the floodplain from Cowley down to Exwick Weir. In June 1976, Hydraulics Research produced a report for the South West Water Authority, successors to the Devon River Authority, proposing further alterations to the river channels. It recommended the diversion of the River Exe to flow during flood conditions into the River Creedy and through Cowley Bridge, which would accommodate much larger flows than the bridge next to the railway at the junction. A flood channel approximately 40 metres wide would be created by widening the Mill Leat from where the flat valve channel joined the Exe to where the Mill Leat flowed into the Creedy, thus taking advantage of the extra wide twin spans of the 1967 Barnstable Line Railway Bridge. Other flood protection proposals were not adopted, but in 1979 land was purchased and the Mill Leat widening was carried out. Essential items involved demolishing the 1967 flat valve channel sluice wall and the accommodation bridges. They were replaced by two new bridges over the Mill Leat next to the Barnstable Line Railway Bridge. The outlet from the turbines at the waterworks used to come out into this channel that I'm standing on, which was the Mill Leat tail race, and the bridge and the pipe crossing that's been built here was a replacement for what we built in 1966. There was also an accommodation bridge on which the diverted water mains were carried. That in turn has been replaced by the accommodation bridge on the east side of the Barnstable line. The turbines are no longer used, so the tail race is no longer necessary, and it's pretty full of vegetation. Over 40 years on, the rich soil of the valley has returned to agricultural production, and the trees have grown again along the river banks, with no sign of the disruption caused by the construction work carried out in the 1960s and 1970s. But this is one of the new accommodation bridges which was built after 1978, when the Mill Leat was widened to accommodate greater flood flows. There's one built, one each side of the Barnstable Line Bridge, which is over here to my right, and downstream, the old accommodation bridge had to be demolished because it was much too narrow for the widened Mill Leat, and this was the replacement. And of course, looking upstream, you can see towards the confluence with the course of the River Exe next to the Great Western Main Line. This is Stafford Bridge, not Stafford's Bridge, about a mile upstream from Cowley Bridge Junction, and it is really where the flooding problems originate. Mark Phillips was the area civil engineer at Exeter during the 1990s and was often involved with issues on the floodplain.
Stafford Bridge here was a frequent trouble spot for us, because when the River Exe reached high flood levels, there was a concern that it might damage the bridge, and we did have to close the line on occasion, maybe once or twice a year, something like that. So what I did was we had a procedure where we would put a watchman out here.
Gosh.
Day and night when the river was high.
It's not much of a job.
No. Well, I think he had a little blindside hut and whatever.
Yeah.
But with instructions to give warning to his supervisor that that the line would be closed if the river level came within a couple of inches below the bottom flange of the main girders. And that, unfortunately, quite often meant a closure of the line for a day or two until the river subsided.
Yeah.
Over time, there's been various schemes looked at whether the bridge could be raised to avoid this closure, coupled with the flooding further downstream at Cowley Bridge Junction, of course, which is all part of the same event usually.
Because it used to flow over the
Yes,
top of the
flow
flood
over
banks
here,
here and go down the wrong side of the railway, didn't it? Yeah.
But nevertheless, if at least this problem could be alleviated, then the closure might happen less frequently.
Yeah.
And so one proposal was to raise the railway profile, but it would require about 2 miles of earthwork, embankment raising.
Yes.
And eventually it was ruled out, I understand, subsequently by Network Rail. This berm here that we're standing on, they keep this at the right profile.
Yes.
If it's too low, then you get too much water going down over the floodplain unnecessarily early. If it's too high, it doesn't afford the protection it's here to provide. So they need to keep an eye on that as well. So it's all quite subtle around here. I did understand there's some sort of threshold monitoring device here now that Network Rail have, that they get warnings from the Environment Agency as well. So I'm wondering if that solar panel is actually the power for the threshold device, actually.
Doing the watchman out of a job.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah. The flood defence scheme down through Exeter that was done after the awful 1960 floods, and which you were involved in those bridges being reconstructed as part of that. I think that's been pretty effective as far as protecting Exeter's concerned. I think the worst problem up here is if they don't manage to rescue any livestock in time. I think this is the only robust scheme that's ever been done. This one that was done in 2018, I think they completed it.
The scheme Mark was referring to resulted from Network Rail's 2013 Weather Resistance and Climate Change study following another serious flood in 2012. Well, back in 1980, an attempt was made to improve the flow of water and to get rid of it from this side of the railway line. So these fairly large diameter pipes were put in, but unfortunately they were found to be not sufficient to deal with the increasing amounts of floodwaters that were being experienced. Contractor Amco Giffen and their consultant Hove Arup were appointed to design and construct 2 large culverts through the embankment upstream of Cowley Bridge Junction. Well, these are the new flood culverts which were installed in 2018 after a study was done by Network Rail following the 2012 disastrous floods that washed out Cowley Bridge Junction completely. And of course the idea is to release the water that comes over the flood banks at Stafford Bridge and finishes up on the wrong side of the railway on the east side, flows down parallel with the railway, finishes up at Cowley Bridge Junction and has nowhere else to go. So having done an in-depth study of the hydrographics of this area, this was the size of culvert that the design engineers decided to install. Well, this is the outlet end of the new culverts, and they discharge onto a rock mattress which forms the bed of the spillway to stop erosion, and the flood waters then discharge down into the River Exe, which is just beyond that whole load of grass and reeds and so on, bulrushes by the look of it, just on the east side of the new Barnstaple Line railway bridge that was built in 1966. On the day we were filming, this was quite slippery. So, as you'll be able to see, the culvert is formed of a load of precast units, all brought in from Shea Murtoch in County Westmeath, and dropped into a gap that was created in the railway embankment during a 75-hour closure of the railway, and all bonded together to form a dual culvert. The wing walls were actually built before the culverts were built, so they were already in place before we had to close the line. The inlet to the culvert from the ground above, this was specifically designed hydraulically to ensure that it had sufficient capacity to direct the water into the culvert, and to prevent scour, these rock-filled mattresses were placed to stop the ground being scoured away from in front of the apron, and also the banks have been reinforced with grass mattresses to help prevent scour to the sides. The depression in the field here that I'm standing in was actually the course of the old River Exe, which before the railway was built, it used to curve round, and you could see it in the crop marks as well. It comes round in a curve and right back round to almost exactly where the new culverts were built in 2018. Well, this was the contractor's compound where their working area was to build these culverts, and it was originally just levelled a whole lot of hardcore put down, and it was a mess. When they finished, that was all taken away, re-topsoiled, seeded, and it's now a beautiful wildflower meadow. There's vetch, there's moon daisies, there's no end of varieties of flowers here. Absolutely superb in just 3 years. Now, when Brunel built the railway and diverted the River Exe, he had to build 2 bridges, one to go over each of them. And to do so, he had to divert the Crediton Road to come up over the top. And so you can see from the bend at the bottom and the hill coming up to the bridges where he diverted the road, which originally came across at ground level and came out by the Cowley Bridge Inn on the Stoke Road. So the Cowley Bridge Inn was on the junction on the corner, and effectively the car park to the Cowley Bridge Inn was actually the old road.
When the Bristol and Exeter Railway was built, the River Exe could have been left to continue across the floodplain to Cowley Bridge. Another option suggested in the 1961 report was to reroute it further west through a wider bridge under the Crediton Road to divert floodwaters away from the railway. Whatever the reason for the decision, there remained the problem of water overflowing the floodbanks at Stafford Bridge. This might have been reduced by providing wider openings where the Exe passes from the east to the west side of the track.
It is hoped that this will be sufficient to discharge any floodwater that comes down this side of the line. So that's what's been built. It's really the first piece of engineering which has specifically addressed the flooding problem at Cowley Bridge Junction since 1897, when one of the culverts was put in by the Great Western Railway. And really all the other flood relief works which have been done on the other side of the railway have done nothing to alleviate this problem as part of the city flood relief scheme to divert water away. We wait to see if it's going to work. So we watch out for the next major flood.
A crossing point of the River Exe at Cowley has probably existed since Roman times. A bridge was first recorded in 1286, presumably with a causeway across the floodplain to raise the road above the flood level. The bridge was finally destroyed by floods in 1810. The present arch bridge has 3 spans totalling 47 metres, reportedly built in less than a year, opening on the 5th of October 1814, and has survived regular flooding for over a century. Only time will tell how the latest flood relief works perform with the predicted climate change and resulting increases in rainfall and river flows.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Dick. That was very good. We've stolen a bit of time there, run on a little bit over the time limit. So could I ask Mark to do the vote of thanks, please? Not because you were mentioned it on numerous occasions.
So I think gents would agree that was a fascinating talk, well put together, well researched. I've been doing it for a long time now, all the time, and over 30 years, which is always surprising. But I have to say, the research, the quality of the photographs, the video, the attention to detail throughout, I think we can all agree, has been superb. I think it's probably worth reflecting the Cowley Bridge is probably the worst place on the whole western route, I think, as far as I'm concerned. There's probably some other sites that come close, Soft Bridge, there's probably some other places down here, near Cowley, that do drive it, but Cowley, certainly for me personally, all those projects, Cowley Bridge, Culvert, that defence of the junction, I think I worked out just that, probably about £7 million worth of funding on doing stuff on Cowley Bridge, so it kind of what it costs. All of that work, but probably a fair amount. So I guess it's probably worth just musing and thinking that we've spent a lot of money on Cowley Bridge over the years. So whether we do raise the railway, I don't know. That's one of the options being looked at the moment. works for the Weird, Jason, Exwick, Cowley and Fine. But you can see the challenges, and Dick really has eloquently highlighted, showcased some excellent production with the videos and talking to us. It's fascinating to me, and I think probably worth just putting our hands together in the usual fashion. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
So
Thank you.
it might be glitched somewhere.